On the frozen morning of December 16th, 1944, the stillness of the Ardennes forest shattered as the thunder of German artillery opened one of the last desperate offensives of the Second World War, the Battle of the Bulge. Snow fell heavily over Belgium and Luxembourg, muffling the chaos of war beneath a cold white shroud. To the Allied soldiers dug into foxholes, the attack was sudden, violent and overwhelming. Columns of German Panzers pushed through narrow roads, infantry advanced through dense woods, and the skies, low, grey and storm-heavy, kept Allied aircraft grounded. For the Germans, it was their final gamble, a last-ditch attempt to fracture the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. For the Americans, it was the beginning of a bitter, bloody struggle in the coldest European winter in living memory. Yet hidden in the arsenal of the Allies was a weapon the Germans did not anticipate, something invisible until the moment of its devastating impact. The proximity fuse, a technological marvel, had transformed the effectiveness of artillery shells. No longer would shells explode only on impact or by a crude timer. Instead, they could sense their target detonating in midair, raining steel upon enemy formations. In the snowy forests of Ardennes, as German troops advanced in tight groups across open fields, this innovation would turn into a nightmare. Entire formations were shredded before they reached the front lines. Survivors recalled the horror, explosions above them, fragments slicing down from the sky, men dropping before they could fire a shot. What was meant to be a bold breakthrough quickly became, in many places, a slaughter. The Germans had planned for tanks, infantry and aircraft, but not for the sky itself to erupt against them. The Ardennes forest in December 1944 was a place where silence could deceive, a landscape where the weight of snow smothered sound, yet carried with it the foreboding of death. American soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, huddled in their foxholes along the front line. They had been told this sector was quiet, a place for resting divisions rather than fierce combat. For days, the snow had been falling relentlessly, covering helmets, rifles, and the earth itself in an unbroken sheet of white. Soldiers passed the hours smoking cigarettes with numb fingers, writing letters home that froze mid-sentence when their ink stiffened in the cold, and staring into the woods with eyes glazed by fatigue. Few believed anything significant would happen here. The war seemed to be moving eastward, with the Allies pushing deeper into Germany. And then, in the pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1944, that illusion was obliterated in an instant. From the German side, the stillness erupted with a torrent of artillery. The sky lit with orange flashes, and the low, rolling hills of the Ardennes quaked under the weight of bombardment. Thousands of shells screamed overhead, exploding in the tree canopy, sending shards of wood and steel downward in lethal showers. Men screamed in the darkness, clutching their helmets, pressing themselves into the frozen ground, praying that the storm of fire would pass. In those first hours, it was not yet clear that this was the opening of the largest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. It was chaos, unrelenting, blinding chaos, and the first American defenders struggled to comprehend the scale of the offensive barreling toward them. For the Germans, this was the last gamble. Hitler had ordered the offensive with almost desperate urgency. The plan was ambitious, perhaps fatally so, a massive thrust through the Ardennes, splitting the Allied forces in two, driving to the critical port of Antwerp, and forcing the Western Allies to the negotiating table. Panzer divisions, veterans of earlier triumphs, were committed once more, bolstered by young soldiers barely trained, thrown into the maw of battle with promises of victory. Columns of tanks and armored vehicles rolled down narrow roads, their engines growling beneath the winter sky, while infantry trudged alongside them, their breath clouds merging with the fog. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS alike carried the weight of expectation that this blow could change the tide of a war slipping inexorably away from them. Yet within the ranks of the German advance, there lingered an unspoken fragility. The Luftwaffe was weak, fuel was scarce, and their supply lines stretched precariously. The offensive depended on surprise and speed, banking on the belief that the Allies had grown complacent in this quiet sector. And indeed, for a time, the surprise worked. American units fell back in confusion, villages were overrun, and roads clogged with retreating vehicles. Soldiers who had been warming themselves with coffee a few hours earlier now found themselves in desperate firefights among the snowdrifts. Civilians fled their homes, carts rattling down icy roads as the thunder of German armor echoed through valleys. The Ardennes, once still and silent, became a place of upheaval, but as the offensive pushed forward, a hidden counter awaited the Germans, something they could not prepare for, something they had never faced on this scale. In the arsenals of the Allies lay the proximity fuse, an invention that seemed almost science fiction to those who first heard of it. Developed in secret, tested and refined under strict security, the proximity fuse was a marvel of wartime innovation. At its heart lay a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, compact enough to fit inside an artillery shell. As the shell approached a target, the reflected radio waves would trigger detonation at the optimum distance, airbursts, perfectly timed, designed to shower shrapnel across wide areas with deadly precision. No longer would shells simply bury themselves into the ground or explode harmlessly past their targets. The sky itself became a weapon, erupting with lethal efficiency above the heads of advancing troops. When American artillerymen were first supplied with these fuses during the Ardennes campaign, they were instructed carefully. Their power was to be used sparingly, guarded against capture, for fear the secret would leak to the enemy. But as the German advance deepened, commanders made a fateful decision: unleash them fully. And so the forests and fields of Belgium became a proving ground for this new form of warfare. Imagine the scene from a German soldier's eyes. Advancing across a snowy clearing, breath sharp in the cold, weapons slung across your shoulder, you hear the distant rumble of American guns. It's not unusual. Artillery has long been part of war. You brace yourself, expecting shells to fall, to carve holes in the earth or detonate against the treetops. But instead, the explosions come from the sky. Shells burst above you midair, and suddenly the world rains death. Fragments whistle downward like invisible razors, cutting through coats, helmets, flesh. Men fall around you, struck before they even raise their rifles. Whole companies collapse in moments, as if invisible scythes sweep across the field. Panic surges. Training evaporates. The tight formations that gave strength now become death traps, every cluster of men a target for airborne annihilation. Survivors scatter, hurling themselves into snowbanks, clawing at the earth for cover that does not exist. American observers on the front watched in awe as the results unfolded. Artillery crews reported devastation unlike anything they had ever seen. Where once it took dozens of shells to break up an attack, now a few well-placed salvos tore entire formations apart. German assaults faltered not only from casualties, but from sheer psychological shock. Survivors described the weapon as death from nowhere, as if the sky itself had turned hostile. In truth, it was not just the steel fragments that shredded their ranks, but the shattering of morale, the realization that they had no defense against what was striking them. Helmets and trenches offered little protection when death descended from above. Triggered not by contact, but by invisible signals. The effectiveness of the proximity fuse during the Battle of the Bulge cannot be overstated. Entire counterattacks were blunted before they even reached American lines. Villages that might have been overwhelmed held firm, because advancing German infantry never made it through the withering barrages. Artillery became not merely supportive, but decisive, reshaping the battlefield in real time. In some cases, advancing panzers found themselves isolated, their infantry support annihilated before their eyes, leaving tanks vulnerable to ambush and counterstrike. The German strategy, built on rapid, overwhelming pressure, broke apart under the weight of this invisible shield. The irony of it all was bitter. Hitler's offensive depended on weather-keeping Allied aircraft grounded, shielding his troops from the skies. Yet even without bombers and fighters, the skies became deadly because of an innovation he had not accounted for. In the cruel twist, the very snowstorms that should have helped the Germans conceal their movements instead created perfect conditions for American artillery. In white, open landscapes, enemy formations stood out starkly. The proximity fuses ensured that no concentration of troops could cross unpunished. In the cold forests of Ardennes, the technology of war had shifted. The Germans came believing they could surprise, overwhelm, and fracture the Allied lines. Instead, they found themselves torn apart by a weapon they could neither predict nor counter. Survivors carried the memory of those airbursts long after the snow melted, a memory of a sky that betrayed them, a silence broken by thunder that did not just fall, it hung above them, waiting, sensing, and then consuming. The days that followed the opening of the German offensive were a storm of confusion and endurance, for the American soldiers spread thin across the Ardennes. Villages with names unfamiliar to most back home, Bastogne, Saint-Vit, Malmedy, became places of legend and of suffering. Roads clogged with desperate refugees, their belongings piled high on carts and wagons, mixed with retreating Allied vehicles. Commanders tried to piece together a coherent response, while German spearheads sliced deeper into the Allied front, creating the bulge that would give the battle its name. For men in the line, there was little sense of strategy. There was only survival. Cold gnawed at their bones. Snow froze their boots solid, and every hour seemed to demand more than the last. Yet it was in these conditions, in the very crucible of despair, that the hidden advantage of the Allies began to reveal itself. Artillery had long been called the king of battle, but for most of the war, it was a weapon of chance as much as skill. Aimed by maps, calculations, and trained instinct, its effectiveness depended on whether shells struck close enough to kill. Ground bursts could churn earth into lethal fragments, but many shells buried themselves too deep, their energy wasted. Time fuses were unreliable, requiring precise settings under battlefield chaos. Too often shells exploded too high or too late, their shrapnel scattered uselessly. The proximity fuse changed all of this. To the men firing the guns, it was almost uncanny. They could now place destruction where it mattered most, not against the ground but above the heads of the enemy. And as German troops massed for attack, the difference was devastating. The first widespread use came as German infantry attempted to exploit breakthroughs. In snowy clearings, they advanced in lines that stretched hundreds of yards. American gunners, positioned behind ridges or in hastily fortified towns, loaded shells with the new fuses. The results were immediate. Observers described the air filling with explosions that seemed to hang above the formations. Bursts of fire suspended in the grey sky, raining jagged steel upon men who had no shelter. Entire platoons crumpled in moments, their officers among the first to fall. The survivors scattered, cohesion broken, and attacks dissolved before they reached American lines. For artillerymen who had once prayed their shells would find targets, it was now as though precision had been handed to them by some unseen hand. Reports spread quickly among the troops. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of the new shells, calling them smart bombs of their age, marveling that they could sense their targets. German prisoners captured in the aftermath revealed their terror. They spoke of shells that seemed alive, that followed them, that chose their moment to strike. Some whispered that the Allies had harnessed a supernatural weapon, a fear stoked by the invisibility of the mechanism. For men on the ground, science offered little comfort, only the certainty that standing together in the open meant death. The shock effect was as powerful as the casualties themselves. Soldiers hesitated before advancing, their steps uncertain, their formations ragged. Every open field became a killing zone, every attempt to mass an assault an invitation for annihilation. Bastogne, perhaps the most famous stronghold of the battle, stood as a testament to what these fuses could achieve. Surrounded and outnumbered, the American defenders clung desperately to the town, cut off from supplies and reinforcement. German forces encircled them, demanding surrender, confident that starvation and exhaustion would do their work. Yet artillery, supplied with proximity fuses, gave Bastogne a lifeline. Every time German units attempted to organize for a push into the town, shells rained down upon them from unseen batteries. Their bursts shattered concentrations of infantry before they could launch coordinated attacks. The defenders could hear the distant thump of their own guns, followed moments later by the eerie bursts in the sky above enemy lines. In those moments, surrounded men felt less alone. Their artillery was their guardian, reaching out through the snow to strike foes they could not see. It was not merely a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of morale. But the use of proximity fuses was not limited to breaking up infantry attacks. German armored spearheads, so critical to the offensive, depended on the support of their accompanying infantry. Without that screen of men to scout, to dig out defenders, and to shield the tanks from ambush, Panzers became exposed. Time and again, proximity fuses shattered that support. Tanks rolled forward only to find themselves isolated, their accompanying grenadiers destroyed in sudden storms of shrapnel. American bazooka teams and tank destroyers, once terrified of armored thrusts, suddenly found opportunities to strike. Artillery became a scalpel, not just a hammer, carving away the sinews of German assaults until their armored skeletons stood alone. To the Germans, it must have seemed as though the battlefield itself had turned against them. The weather, which they had counted on, had indeed grounded Allied planes, but now the artillery replaced the bombers in lethality. Snowfields glistened deceptively, inviting attack, yet every mass of men upon them was punished with surgical ferocity. Survivors stumbled back through forests, carrying with them tales of horror. Comrades torn apart by invisible bursts, officers cut down mid-command, entire companies erased before a single rifle fired. Word spread among the ranks, and with it came hesitation, fear, and doubt, the enemies of any offensive. The Americans, too, recognized the transformation. Commanders spoke with awe of the results. Eisenhower himself later acknowledged that the proximity fuse had been one of the war's most important developments, second only to the atomic bomb in its impact. Yet on the snowy ridges and in the frozen foxholes, the significance was felt less in words than in survival. Men lived who otherwise would have died. Towns held that otherwise would have fallen. The line bent but did not break, and much of that resilience traced back to the thunder of guns whose shells knew when and where to strike. Still, for all its brilliance, the fuse did not end the suffering of the Ardennes. Battles raged with brutal ferocity. Men froze to death in foxholes, and villages were reduced to ruins. Civilians bore the brunt, their homes shattered by bombardment, their fields scarred by tank treads. The proximity fuse was a marvel of science, but like all weapons, it existed in a world of pain. For every German formation destroyed, there were human lives behind the statistics. Boys pulled from schools to fight, fathers torn from families, men who, in another world, might have been farmers or workers, rather than casualties of history. The snow that fell across the Ardennes did not discriminate. It covered the dead of both sides alike, erasing their features, turning them into shapes frozen in white silence. As the days stretched into weeks, the German advance slowed, faltered, and finally reversed. Fuel shortages crippled their tanks. Resistance stiffened at every village, and the weight of Allied reinforcements began to press back. The bulge in the line that had threatened catastrophe gradually shrank. Yet behind this turning of the tide lay the quiet, relentless contribution of the proximity fuse. It had denied the enemy the massing of forces, blunted the spearheads, and preserved the fragile front long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It had, in many ways, given time, the most precious commodity in war. Time for the 101st Airborne to hold Bastogne. Time for Patton's Third Army to swing north in its legendary march. Time for the Allies to turn desperation into defiance, and defiance into victory. And when the battle was done, when the forests no longer echoed with the roar of artillery, those who survived looked back on the winter of 1944 with a kind of disbelief. The Ardennes had been hell, a place where the cold killed as surely as bullets, where the earth itself seemed determined to consume men whole. Yet it had also been a place of revelation, where the ingenuity of science revealed its terrible hand. The proximity fuse, once a guarded secret, had become a legend among soldiers. Some called it the gift of the gods, others simply called it the reason they were alive. By late December, the Battle of the Bulge had reached its most desperate and decisive phase. The German advance, which had begun with thunderous momentum, was now slowing under the weight of both resistance and attrition. The initial breakthroughs had stretched their lines, creating a bulge that protruded deeply into Allied territory, but left the attackers vulnerable on either flank. Supplies ran thin. Fuel, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, became scarce to the point of crippling. Tanks ground to a halt for lack of gasoline, abandoned on icy roads like broken beasts. The surprise that had carried the Germans forward now began to fade, replaced by the grim mathematics of attrition, where every mile gained demanded lives they could not spare. Yet the fighting did not relent. Each village, each crossroad, each frozen river crossing became a battlefield unto itself, contested with ferocity that left entire landscapes in ruins. The Americans, for their part, clung desperately to survival in the early days. Units that had been shattered regrouped. Commanders improvised defenses, pulling together men from scattered divisions and throwing them into the line wherever holes threatened to open. Bastogne, encircled and bombarded, held out with a stubbornness that defied the odds. When the German commander demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. That defiance echoed through the frozen fields, a symbol of American resolve at its bleakest moment. Yet beneath the slogans and acts of defiance lay a quieter, more relentless factor: the thunder of artillery armed with proximity fuses. Even as the defenders suffered, even as they counted rations and wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of warmth they could find, they could rely on their guns to strike with uncanny effect. In the forests around Bastogne, the Germans sought to crush the pocket with infantry assaults. Again and again, they gathered their strength, forming up for attacks that they hoped would overwhelm the exhausted paratroopers and armor within. Each time, the Americans called down fire, and each time, the air above German ranks erupted with bursts of steel. The snow itself seemed to explode, showering fragments downward, cutting through trees and men alike. Survivors stumbled back into the woods, leaving the ground littered with bodies. Their assault shattered before it could even touch the American lines. The defenders, watching from their foxholes, marveled at the devastation. They had known artillery all their lives, but never like this. The proximity fuse turned their guns into guardians that could stop entire waves before they crested. Bastogne held not simply through grit and defiance, but because every German attempt to break it was torn apart by fire from above. For the German soldiers on the ground, the experience was shattering. Already they struggled with the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion of endless marching through snow and ice. Now when they gathered their courage to attack, they were met not by men in trenches, but by invisible death from the sky. Shells that once might have overshot or buried themselves in harmless craters now burst with precision, catching them in the open. Helmets and coats offered no defense against the rain of fragments. Entire squads vanished in seconds, leaving only silence and the muffled crunch of snow settling over the dead. Survivors described the terror of advancing into fields where nothing moved, only to hear the shriek of shells overhead and know in that instant that the sky itself had betrayed them. The psychological toll was immense. German officers struggled to rally men who no longer believed in the possibility of victory. Rumors spread through the ranks, exaggerating the nature of the weapon, giving it almost mythical qualities. Some believed the Allies had found a way to see through clouds, to guide shells directly onto them with supernatural precision. The truth, that it was a triumph of engineering, a radio signal embedded in a fuse, mattered little to those huddled in foxholes, waiting for the next burst to tear them apart. Morale, already fragile, began to fray. Fear spread like frost through the ranks, chilling the will to fight even before bullets were fired. Yet the battle was not simply one of weapons, but of endurance. For the Americans, the Ardennes was a crucible unlike any they had known. The winter was bitter beyond measure. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Snow drifts rose waist-deep, and frostbite claimed almost as many casualties as enemy fire. Men wrapped their feet in rags, stuffed newspapers into their coats, and clung together for warmth in icy foxholes. They fought not only the enemy, but the elements, and many wondered if they would survive either. In those conditions, the proximity fuse became more than just a weapon. It was a form of salvation. To know that their artillery could reach out and break enemy attacks before they arrived gave the frozen defenders hope. A sense that the line could hold, that the ordeal was not in vain. For commanders, the proximity fuse became a tool that reshaped strategy. Where once they might have pulled back in the face of overwhelming infantry, now they held, trusting their guns to thin the enemy before they reached the front. Positions that might have been abandoned were defended, and those defenses often held. Every successful stand bought time, and in war, time is the currency that buys reinforcements, supplies, and eventual victory. The Germans had gambled on speed, on momentum carrying them to Antwerp before the Allies could recover. But each time artillery with proximity fuses shattered their assaults, that momentum slowed. Every delay weakened them, stretched their supply lines, and deepened the cracks in their offensive. By Christmas, the tide was turning. Patton's Third Army, in a feat of maneuver that would enter legend, wheeled northward to relieve Bastogne. Columns of tanks and trucks churned through snow and ice, arriving just as the defenders' strength threatened to break. When they linked up, cheers echoed through the frozen ruins of the town, the sound of relief after days of encirclement. Yet even as fresh troops arrived, the memory of those days lingered. The knowledge that artillery, armed with a secret fuse, had held the line when all else seemed lost. Bastogne did not fall, and in its survival lay the unraveling of the German plan. For the Germans, the failure of the Ardennes offensive was catastrophic. The loss of men, tanks, and material could not be replaced. Their last reserves had been thrown into the snow and broken against a line that had bent but never shattered. The offensive that Hitler had hoped would split the Allies instead bled his army white, leaving them weakened for the final push into Germany. Among the many reasons for this failure, the weather, the lack of fuel, the stubbornness of the defenders, the proximity fuse stands as one of the most decisive. It denied the Germans their greatest advantage, the ability to mass forces and strike with overwhelming strength. It turned their own strategy against them, ensuring that every attempt to gather strength became a liability. When the snows of the Ardennes finally melted months later, they revealed not just the scars of battle, but the silent testimony of what had happened. Fields were littered with fragments of shells, twisted shards of steel that once rained down with lethal precision. Among them lay the remnants of a secret once guarded so closely, now revealed by its impact on the battlefield. The proximity fuse had stepped from the realm of secrecy into legend, proving itself in the crucible of one of the war's fiercest battles. To the soldiers who survived, it was more than technology. It was the difference between life and death, defeat and survival. And yet, as with all weapons, its story was one of paradox. For every American who credited the fuse with saving his life, there was a German who cursed it as the instrument of his death. For every formation shattered, there were families who would never see their sons return. War is never simply a story of victories and defeats. It is a ledger written in human lives, tallied in grief and memory. The proximity fuse, brilliant and terrible, became one more line in that ledger. But in the cold, unforgiving winter of 1944, it was a line that helped ensure the survival of a fragile front, and in so doing hastened the end of a war that had already claimed too much. When the German tide finally broke in January of 1945, the Ardennes returned to silence, though it was a silence scarred and unnatural. Forests, once heavy with snow and stillness, now bore the blackened stumps of trees shattered by artillery fire. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to husks of stone and timber, their streets filled with rubble and the charred remains of homes. The roadsides were lined with the carcasses of tanks, their metal twisted by fire, their crews long since claimed by the cold. For those who walked the battlefield in the aftermath, the scale of destruction was overwhelming. The Bulge had consumed men, machines, and landscapes alike, and woven through the devastation was the undeniable mark of a weapon that had tipped the balance, the proximity fuse, American units advancing. In the wake of the German retreat found evidence of its impact everywhere. Snowfields were littered with bodies that bore no single wound, but many struck by fragments that descended from airbursts. Equipment lay abandoned, where formations had dissolved under sudden storms of steel. Entire German regiments had been cut to pieces before they could close with American defenses. Survivors spoke of terror, of invisible bursts that robbed them of courage as much as comrades. It was not the brute force of tanks or the roar of aircraft that had undone them, but something more insidious, quieter, a weapon that hovered above and struck with merciless timing, For the Allies, the proximity fuse was more than just a tactical advantage. It became a symbol of technological superiority. In a war where Germany had stunned the world with innovations like the V-2 rocket and the jet fighter, here was proof that Allied science could match and surpass their ingenuity. The fuse represented not only a weapon, but a philosophy, the belief that the marriage of science and strategy could decide battles as surely as bravery and blood. American and British scientists, working in secrecy, had produced something that reshaped modern warfare. And the Ardennes had been its stage. The men who fired those shells often spoke of a strange dissonance. To them, the proximity fuse felt almost like cheating. They had grown up in an era when artillery was imprecise, when victory meant pounding the earth until sheer numbers produced results. Now with the twist of a fuse, they could rain precision death upon enemies hidden behind ridges or advancing in fields. They watched through binoculars as entire attacks disintegrated under airbursts, and they knew that something had shifted in the very nature of war. The machine gun had once revolutionized the battlefield, turning massed charges into suicide. Now, artillery with proximity fuses had done the same, reshaping how armies could and could not move. The Germans, for their part, had no answer. Their own scientists, brilliant though they were, had never developed anything like it. Captured fuses astonished them, but by the time they understood the principle, it was too late. The Reich was crumbling, its cities burning under relentless Allied bombing, its armies retreating on every front. The Battle of the Bulge had been their last great gamble, and the failure was total. From the Ardennes onward, Germany no longer fought to win, it fought merely to delay the inevitable. Every mile lost brought the Allies closer to the Rhine, and every battle fought bled the Wehrmacht dry. Yet the story of the proximity fuse did not end with the Ardennes. Its legacy extended into the final months of the war and beyond. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they brought with them artillery units equipped with the fuses, ensuring that German counterattacks could be blunted with devastating efficiency. In the Pacific, proximity fuses were fitted to anti-aircraft shells, transforming the defense of ships against kamikaze attacks. Sailors who once fired blind into the sky now watched with relief as enemy planes were torn apart mid-dive, struck by explosions that seemed to anticipate their movements. From the forests of Belgium to the waters of Okinawa, the fuse became a quiet guardian, unseen but decisive. The men who had endured the Ardennes carried its memory with them long after the war. Veterans spoke of nights when the cold seeped into their bones so deeply they thought it would never leave, of mornings when they awoke half buried in snow, of days when hunger and fear seemed endless. Yet they also spoke of the strange comfort they felt when they heard their artillery fire. The distant thud of guns was not just a sound of destruction, but of protection, a reminder that they were not alone, that unseen hands reached across miles to shield them. In letters home, some described the fuses without naming them, speaking only of shells that knew where to strike, weapons that had turned despair into survival. For the Germans, memory was harsher. Survivors remembered comrades cut down by bursts they could not anticipate, advances that ended before they began. Some described nightmares of skies exploding, of snowfields erupting in flame. For them, the proximity fuse was not an abstraction of science, but a terror lived in blood and steel. The Ardennes, meant to be their triumph, became their grave, and the fuse was one of the shovels that buried them. The broader world, too, began to recognize the fuse's significance. In the post-war years, generals and historians alike ranked it among the most important technological breakthroughs of the conflict. Eisenhower himself declared it one of the 4 indispensable weapons of the Allied victory, placing it alongside the atomic bomb, radar, and the C-47 transport aircraft. Churchill, with characteristic flair, called it the second most important development of the modern war. To leaders who had watched the tides of battle shift with its use, the praise was no exaggeration. The proximity fuse had not only saved Bastogne and blunted the Bulge, it had altered the calculus of modern combat. And yet, in reflecting on its legacy, one is struck by the paradox of human ingenuity. The proximity fuse was a marvel of engineering, a testament to what minds could achieve under pressure. It saved lives, shortened battles, and hastened the defeat of tyranny. But it also killed in numbers that defy comprehension, shredding men who never even saw their enemy's face. It was both miracle and curse, salvation and damnation, depending on which side of the shell one stood. In this duality lies the eternal truth of war, that every innovation, no matter how brilliant, comes at a cost paid in flesh. In the Ardennes, amid the silence that followed, the snow covered the evidence as if to erase it. Graves were dug, bodies buried, ruins rebuilt. But beneath the white blanket lay fragments of a story too profound to vanish. The proximity fuse had turned the sky into a weapon, had given defenders a shield made of fire, had broken the last hope of a regime that had plunged the world into darkness. Its story is inseparable from the men who lived and died beneath those winter skies. Americans who endured, Germans who perished, civilians who suffered in the middle. The fuse was a weapon, but its story is human, as all weapons' stories are. By February of 1945, the forests of the Ardennes were once again silent, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath it lay the exhaustion of a Wehrmacht that had bled itself dry in a gamble it could never afford. The German dream of splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace had vanished like smoke in the frozen air. The Bulge they had driven into the American lines had flattened, and with it collapsed the last illusion of strategic initiative. From here onward, the Reich was on the defensive, fighting not for victory, but for time. And in that desperate twilight, the weapons that the Allies carried, including the now proven proximity fuse, became more than tools of war. They became instruments that accelerated the end of the conflict, reshaping the very tempo of Germany's final collapse. As American forces regrouped after the Bulge, their artillerymen carried a confidence that had been hardened in fire. They had seen what the proximity fuse could do against massed German infantry, how it turned the enemy's momentum into chaos and destruction. No longer was artillery solely about saturation or guesswork. It had become a scalpel in the midst of battle, carving formations apart before they could strike. As the Allies began their drive toward the Rhine, every major advance was underpinned by a relentless rhythm of shells bursting not in mud, but in air, raining steel across German strongpoints, roadways, and counter-attacking columns. The defenders, already depleted from their failed winter gamble, faced a nightmare of constant bombardment. Even in villages fortified for defense, they found no safety, for shells now detonated just above rooftops, spraying stone and fire into cellars where civilians and soldiers alike huddled in fear. The proximity fuse was particularly merciless during the clearing of the Siegfried Line, the formidable belt of bunkers, minefields, and dragon's teeth that guarded Germany's western border. In earlier years, such fortifications might have slowed armies for months, bleeding attackers in costly assaults. But by 1945, Allied tactics had matured, and the fuse added a new dimension. Instead of hammering bunkers endlessly with conventional high explosives, American gunners used timed air bursts to strip away the infantry protecting them. German defenders, caught in trenches and tree lines, were shredded before they could retreat to hardened positions. The once vaunted West Wall became less a shield than a death trap, where men could neither advance nor hide from the explosions above. For Allied infantry pressing forward, the effect was transformative. The defenses still required courage and sacrifice to breach, but the artillery behind them had become a constant guardian, eroding resistance before it could gather strength. Meanwhile, German morale sank lower with each week. Letters from the front reveal the despair that proximity fuse bombardments sowed among soldiers. Men spoke of skies that betrayed them, of shells that seemed to hunt them with unnatural precision. Some units believed the Americans had developed a weapon guided by radio or even sorcery, rumors born of desperation but fueled by genuine terror. The psychological toll was immense. The Wehrmacht had long prided itself on discipline and endurance, but by 1945, even veteran troops struggled against a sense of futility. Every counterattack was crushed, every defensive stand dissolved under invisible storms. Hunger gnawed at their strength, fuel shortages crippled their mobility, and above it all, the artillery pounded relentlessly, turning every position into a fleeting grave. For civilians trapped in the shrinking Reich, the story was even bleaker. Towns along the Rhine became battlegrounds, caught between German orders to resist to the last and Allied determination to push forward. Artillery barrages, though aimed at military targets, inevitably tore through neighborhoods, reducing centuries-old communities to rubble. Civilians remembered the airbursts with particular horror. Unlike ground explosions, which tore apart streets and walls, the bursts above rooftops sent jagged fragments cascading into courtyards, attics, and basements. For families already battered by years of bombing, the final months of the war became a blur of fire and ash. And yet, many of those civilians would later recall the strange paradox of their suffering, that it was these weapons of destruction which, by hastening Germany's defeat, also hastened their liberation from a regime that had led them to ruin. By March 1945, the Rhine itself, the great natural barrier that had so often shielded Germany, was under threat. For centuries, invading armies had been halted at its banks, its waters a final wall between west and east. But now, as Allied armies gathered along its edge, the Rhine was less fortress than milestone. The Germans, weakened and reeling, struggled to organize any meaningful defense. Artillery units with proximity fuses played a pivotal role in clearing crossings, bombarding German positions on the far bank, and suppressing counterattacks before they could gain momentum. At Remagen, where American forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge in a daring coup, proximity fuse shells helped hold the bridgehead against furious German attempts to destroy it. For days, the sky above the Rhine shimmered with bursts as American gunners shielded their engineers and infantry, ensuring that what had once been a symbol of German pride became a gateway for the invasion of their homeland. The crossing of the Rhine marked more than a tactical success. It was the symbolic unraveling of Hitler's promises. The Reich that had proclaimed itself invincible, destined for 1,000 years, was now penetrated in its heartland. Cities like Cologne, Mainz, and Koblenz fell in rapid succession, their defenders unable to withstand the combination of Allied armor, air power, and artillery precision. The proximity fuse, once a closely guarded secret, was now employed with open confidence, its reputation already known to the enemy. German units retreating eastward described entire columns destroyed by airburst fire, vehicles shredded before they could escape. The pace of collapse quickened, and the once mighty Wehrmacht became a shadow of itself, fragments of divisions fighting in isolation, fueled more by orders and fear of retribution than by any belief in victory. As the Allies surged deeper into Germany, the role of artillery shifted from breakthrough to pursuit. With mobility on their side, American forces often outran German defenses, forcing artillery units to adapt quickly. Yet even in fast-moving operations, the proximity fuse proved indispensable. Roads clogged with retreating troops were perfect targets for shells that exploded above, scattering survivors and blocking movement with wreckage. Forest paths, once havens for ambushes, became death traps when airbursts detonated over the tree canopy, raining splinters and shattered wood on hidden positions. The Germans could neither mass for counterattacks nor melt away unseen. Everywhere they turned, the reach of Allied artillery found them. By April 1945, the Reich was in free fall. The Americans advanced from the west, the Soviets from the east, and in between lay a nation in ruins. Cities burned, refugees streamed along every road, and the last loyal soldiers dug into positions they knew they could not hold. The proximity fuse was still there, in the background of every battle, a quiet enforcer ensuring that no gathering of German strength could go unpunished. Outside Leipzig, Nuremberg, and countless smaller towns, bursts lit the sky as artillery supported infantry clearing house by house. For the German people, the final weeks of war were a relentless barrage, each explosion a reminder that the end was approaching. Even as the Allies approached victory, they remained aware of the weapon's significance. Reports circulated of how the proximity fuse had saved countless lives during the Ardennes and beyond, of how it had transformed artillery into something far more lethal. Generals wrote assessments that praised it in near-mythic terms, noting that without it, battles might have dragged on longer, costing thousands more lives. In mess halls and barracks, soldiers spoke of it with awe, often without fully understanding the science behind it. To them it was simple. The shells worked, they killed the enemy, and they kept friends alive. That was enough. For the Germans, the final irony was bitter. They had pioneered so many terrifying weapons during the war, rockets, jet aircraft, new tanks, yet in the end, it was an Allied invention, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, that had played a decisive role in sealing their fate. Captured documents and testimonies reveal their frustration, their sense of being outmatched not only on the battlefield, but in the realm of innovation. By May 1945, as the Reich collapsed and Hitler lay dead in his bunker, proximity fuses were still firing, still bursting above crumbling defenses. When the guns finally fell silent on May 8th, they left behind not only a defeated enemy, but a legacy of technology that would shape wars to come. When the guns at last fell silent on May 8th, 1945, Europe lay in ruins. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 long years had ended in fire, ash, and surrender. Yet even in the relief of victory, memories of the final months lingered heavily among those who had fought them. For the American soldiers who had endured the freezing forests of Ardennes and the bitter push across the Rhine, the weapon that stood most vividly in their minds was not always the rifle slung across their shoulder or the tank rumbling beside them, but the artillery shells that had burst above their heads, unleashed by a fuse so ingenious that most barely understood its mechanics. The proximity fuse, once hidden in secrecy, had by the end of the war become a legend whispered in foxholes, written in diaries, and recorded in after-action reports. It had turned the tide at moments when collapse seemed possible, and its echoes carried into the uncertain peace that followed. Among veterans, the recollections of the fuse were often personal, deeply tied to survival. An infantryman who had crouched under a snow-covered log near Bastogne remembered watching German soldiers break from cover to advance across an open slope. He recalled the eerie split second when shells detonated not on the ground, but in the sky above, showering the field with fire. It was as though the air itself had turned against them, he wrote years later. Others spoke of the psychological relief that came from knowing their artillery had an edge. For soldiers on the front line, belief in the fuse became a source of confidence, even superstition. Some joked that the shells could smell the enemy. To young men far from home, fighting in a frozen hell, that belief, half science, half magic, offered comfort in an otherwise chaotic world. For the Germans who survived the shelling, the memories were darker, more haunting. Prisoners of war interrogated in the spring of 1945 often spoke of the invisible terror that had broken their will. The shells exploded above us, always above us, one soldier explained, his hands trembling as he described the slaughter of his company near Houffalize. We could not hide. The earth gave no shelter. The sky betrayed us. Another confessed that entire battalions had been undone not just by casualties, but by fear, the paralyzing knowledge that gathering in numbers invited annihilation. To men raised on discipline and drilled in obedience, the proximity fuse became a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It eroded the very cohesion upon which German tactics depended. When they spoke of defeat, many did not blame the Americans' bravery or even their tanks. They blamed the shells that burst overhead. Civilians, too, carried memories etched by the new weapon. In villages along the Rhine and in the shattered towns of Western Germany, survivors remembered the airbursts with particular clarity. Mothers described children covering their ears against explosions that seemed to rain from the heavens, shards of glass and stone falling like hail. Farmers recalled fields littered with fragments, their livestock torn apart by blasts meant for soldiers. And yet, for many, those memories were entwined with the realization that the proximity fuse had accelerated the end. It was terrible, one woman from Koblenz recalled decades later, but it meant the war was ending sooner. Every day earlier was a day fewer of hunger, fewer of death. Their testimonies, painful though they were, revealed the paradox of war, that the same weapon which inflicted horror could also shorten suffering. Commanders, historians, and policymakers reflected in different terms, framing the fuse not only as a battlefield tool, but as a symbol of technological triumph. Reports circulated through Washington and London praising its effectiveness, some calling it the single most important invention of the war after radar and the atomic bomb. Generals like George Patton marveled at its effect, while artillery commanders spoke of it with near reverence. The British credited it with saving London from V-1 rockets, while the Americans highlighted its decisive role at the Bulge. In post-war analyses, staff officers often remarked that without it, the Ardennes offensive might have dragged on far longer, perhaps altering the timing of the war's end. Even the Soviets, though initially skeptical, quietly sought to understand and replicate the fuse, recognizing its value in modern combat. The secrecy surrounding its development only added to its mystique. During the war, the Allies had guarded the fuse with extraordinary vigilance, fearful that a captured example might allow the Germans to develop countermeasures. Factories in the United States had churned out millions of the tiny devices, employing scientists, engineers, and even entire universities in a vast, hidden effort. When the war ended, the scale of that enterprise stunned those who learned of it. The story of the fuse became part of the larger narrative of scientific warfare, a reminder that battles were not won by bravery alone, but by ingenuity, cooperation, and the marriage of science to strategy. In this sense, the fuse was more than a weapon. It was a harbinger of the modern age, where wars would be shaped as much in laboratories as on battlefields. For veterans returning home, the proximity fuse remained a ghost in their stories. At kitchen tables and veterans' reunions, they recalled the sounds of airbursts, the sight of enemy formations torn apart, the relief of knowing artillery could shield them. Yet beneath the pride often lay unease. Many struggled with the memory of what they had witnessed. The German soldiers caught in open fields, the civilians who had suffered alongside combatants, the destruction so complete it seemed almost inhuman. The fuse, for all its brilliance, forced men to confront the brutal truth that technology could magnify death as easily as it could save lives. In post-war America, where prosperity flourished and families rebuilt, some veterans chose silence rather than recounting those memories. But in their silence, the weight of the weapon remained. The Cold War added a new dimension to that legacy. As the United States and Soviet Union stared at one another across a divided Europe, the lessons of the proximity fuse informed new doctrines. The principle that technology could tilt the balance of power became central to strategy. Just as the fuse had multiplied the effectiveness of artillery, so too would new inventions, jet aircraft, guided missiles, nuclear weapons, reshape the battlefield of the future. In this light, the proximity fuse was both a triumph and a warning. It demonstrated how quickly a scientific breakthrough could alter the fate of nations. And it foreshadowed a world where such breakthroughs might not merely shorten wars, but threaten civilization itself. In the end, the story of the proximity fuse was not only about victory, but about memory. How different peoples remembered the same explosions in radically different ways. To Americans, it was a symbol of ingenuity and salvation. To Germans, it was a reminder of defeat and helplessness. To civilians, it was both terror and release. And to historians, it was proof of the extraordinary, often terrifying capacity of human invention. In museums today, fragments of proximity fuse shells rest in glass cases, their small, unassuming forms belying the immense impact they once carried. Visitors walk past them, scarcely pausing, unaware that these simple devices once turned forests into infernos and bent the course of history. But for those who lived through the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945, their sound still echoes, the burst above, the rain of fragments. The knowledge that the war's end was written not only in courage and sacrifice, but in a fuse no larger than a man's hand. The war ended, but the echoes of its weapons never truly faded. In the silence that followed, May 1945, as Europe lay broken and the world struggled to absorb the cost of victory, the memory of the proximity fuse lingered like a faint ringing in the ears of history. It was not the most famous weapon of the war. It did not carry the dread of the atomic bomb, nor the romantic mythology of the Spitfire, nor even the grim familiarity of the Sherman or Tiger tank. Yet for those who had been beneath the bursting skies of Ardennes or across the Rhine, it was unforgettable. The fuse was a symbol of a deeper truth, that wars are not only contests of courage, but of ideas. and that the smallest spark of invention can cast the longest shadows. In the forest where the Bulge had raged, spring eventually returned. Snow melted, grass pushed through churned soil, and wildflowers covered ground once soaked in blood. Farmers returned to fields littered with twisted metal, and children played in meadows that had been killing grounds just months earlier. Yet in these places, remnants of the proximity fuse were still found. Small fragments of steel, jagged shards of shells, broken circuitry hidden in the dirt. To those who stumbled upon them, they were relics both ordinary and profound, scraps of a device that had once decided the fate of armies. For local people rebuilding their lives, they were reminders that history was not an abstraction, but a scar beneath their feet. For veterans who visited decades later, standing among the graves of fallen comrades, those fragments were ghosts of a winter when the sky itself seemed to turn against the enemy. The paradox of memory haunted all who reflected on it. The proximity fuse had saved lives, tens of thousands, perhaps more. American infantry units spared the terror of mass German counterattacks, knew they owed their survival in part to those airburst shells. Yet those same shells had ended countless other lives in sudden, horrific ways. The technology did not discriminate. It did not ask whether a soldier was brave or reluctant, whether he believed in the cause or simply obeyed orders. It only detonated efficiently and mercilessly as designed. And so when survivors remembered it, they often did so with a conflicted tone, gratitude mixed with unease, relief entwined with sorrow. Historians, too, wrestled with its meaning. In the decades that followed, the proximity fuse was studied as a triumph of Allied science and industrial capacity. Its development involved universities, laboratories, and industries working in harmony at a scale never before attempted. The project foreshadowed the great military-industrial complexes of the Cold War, where science and war would become inseparable. But beyond technical achievement, the fuse raised questions of morality. Was it right to celebrate a weapon that caused such devastation? Or was it necessary to remember it precisely because it revealed the double edge of human invention? The capacity to both save and destroy, to shorten suffering, yet intensify it. These questions found no easy answers, echoing in lecture halls, in war memorials, and in the silence of those who had lived through its fire. The veterans who carried its memory grew older. By the 1960s and 70s, reunions of the Battle of the Bulge brought men together in European villages rebuilt from rubble. They shared stories, raised glasses, and walked through cemeteries where white crosses stretched in endless rows. Often they spoke of the weather, the food, the cold. But when conversations turned to combat, one detail returned again and again: the artillery. We would have been overrun if not for the shells bursting above, one veteran told his grandson decades later. His voice broke as he spoke, torn between pride and grief. I lived because of it, and because of it, others didn't. For him, as for so many, the proximity fuse was not merely a weapon of victory, but a burden of survival. In Germany, memories took a different shape. Survivors of the winter offensive remembered hunger, retreat, and the crushing power of enemy fire. Former soldiers wrote in memoirs of the hopelessness they felt under airbursts, the way morale dissolved when no cover seemed to matter. Some carried bitterness, others resignation, a few even relief that the war ended sooner than it might have. Among civilians, recollections of the shells were woven into broader memories of bombing, displacement, and loss. For them, the proximity fuse was one thread in a vast tapestry of destruction that had consumed their nation. And yet, even amid their suffering, some acknowledged its role in ending Hitler's regime, in breaking the machinery that had dragged them into ruin. Their testimonies revealed the complexity of human memory, anger at pain endured, relief at tyranny defeated. As the world moved into the nuclear age, the proximity fuse seemed for a time to fade into obscurity. The mushroom cloud overshadowed every other weapon, casting the fuse as a smaller chapter in the epic of 20th century destruction. Yet within military circles its legacy endured. Modern guided munitions, radar-based systems, and precision strike doctrines all carried its DNA. The fuse was a stepping stone toward the idea that technology could make war cleaner, faster, more decisive, an idea that still haunts debates today. In truth, war never became clean. The proximity fuse had shown that efficiency did not erase suffering, it only compressed it. The fragments of steel it scattered were as sharp and lethal as any weapon before or since. Its legacy was not just technological progress, but the enduring reminder that progress in war always carries a human price. Cinematically, one can imagine the documentary camera drifting through landscapes of memory, the forests of Ardennes bathed in morning mist, where sunlight filters through trees once splintered by shells, the banks of the Rhine, where water flows past rebuilt bridges, the rows of graves in quiet cemeteries, where names carved in stone whisper the cost of victory. The voiceover softens, reflective, as if inviting the viewer to pause, to breathe, to absorb. The proximity fuse, it says, was not just a device of metal and circuitry. It was an idea that the smallest spark of human invention can decide the fate of millions. It was a reminder that in war, as in peace, our creations reflect us, our brilliance, our desperation, our cruelty, our hope. And in that reflection lies the heart of the story. The Germans were surprised when entire formations fell beneath airbursts at the Battle of the Bulge. But perhaps we too remain surprised when we look back, not just at the weapon, but at ourselves, at what we are capable of when pressed to the edge of survival, at what we unleash in the name of victory, and at how, even in the quiet decades after, the memory of those bursts lingers, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who lived beneath them.